Saxon England. Today, for the first time, we're really going to go and look a little bit at British history. British history, for some what will become fairly obvious reasons, is probably of special importance, if not interest, to those of us living in the US. And to sort of lay out the scenery first, here is the island of Great Britain, Ireland to its immediate west. Great Britain is in northwestern Europe, facing the Atlantic. And to understand a lot of its history, it's important to keep in mind its geography. In the north and the west of the island, there are a lot of mountains, as you can just sort of see from the roughness of the terrain in this map. While the east, and especially the southeast, are much flatter and smoother. The best land for farming is in the southeast. Again, with the east better than the west, the south better than the north. The island as a whole is basically straight in the path of the Gulf Stream, bringing warm water from the Gulf of Mexico to northwest Europe. This is really important for a couple of reasons. One, it means the climate is a lot milder than it would be otherwise. For instance, Edinburgh in southern Scotland today, if it were at the same same longitude as Atlanta, it would be in Hudson's Bay where the polar bears swim and barely any population. Instead, because of the Gulf Stream, it is significantly warmer than otherwise. The Gulf Stream also brings a lot of rain. Those mountains in the west catch a lot of the rain, meaning that the west is significantly wetter than the east. There were, however, in ancient times, a lot of marshlands in the eastern part of Britain. Most of those were drained long ago. Now, all of Britain was underneath the ice during the Ice Age. So really human settlement only begins after the ice is melted. Hunter-gatherers are going to be replaced by Neolithic farmers. Some of the Neolithic farmers in Britain will put up major monuments like Stonehenge, probably about 4,000 years ago. And at some point after that, people bringing Indo-European languages arrive. By the time of the Roman Empire, when we start having written records, pretty much everyone, as far as we know, in the British Isles were speaking related languages of the Celtic family. Britain does get brought into the Roman Empire, at least in part. It's one of the very last areas the Romans conquer. At the time they arrive, Britain is divided into various tribes speaking Celtic languages. The Romans called these people the Britons. A nice little, very slight change in word. And the conquest only really starts in the year 43. It will take about 100 years to do most of the conquering. And the southern part of the island, that is England, Wales, and southern Scotland, are brought under Roman control. The Romans built two walls, one under the Emperor Hadrian, separating the area they conquered from the unconquered areas. First built by Hadrian in 122, is in north of what's now in England. A second wall is built further north by Antoninus Pius about 70 years later, and restored by Septimius Severus at the beginning of the 3rd century. So, here we see a map of Roman Britain, as it would have looked around the year 410, divided into 5 sub-provinces. It is heavily militarized. The Romans built highways connecting major centers throughout the island. North of the walls is what had been called Caledonia. This is an area that the Romans invade multiple times, but are never successfully able to conquer. It remains one of the troublesome areas for them. The people who were there when they arrived, the Caledones, would give way to a group the Romans called Picti, meaning the painted people, but from their own name, Picts. We call them the Picts. We would think of the land of Picts and Caledonians as Scotland today. However, in Roman times, the Scots, or the Scoti, as the Romans called them, are the inhabitants of Ireland. Just all gets about to change around. While the Romans are ruling Britain, the Roman economy develops, the Celtic leadership adopts Roman culture, cities are built in the south and east of the island. This is the gate to the Roman city of Lincoln, one of the larger cities of the time. This is the Roman spa at the city of Bath, which gets its name because of the extensive Roman baths that are still visible. Now, most of the local government is based on the old tribes, Celtic tribes, who usually now develop a town for themselves as a new city. In the towns, Roman culture is adopted very quickly. In the countryside, it takes longer, but people steadily become integrated into the broader Roman world, so much so that Christianity will arrive. Later legends say Christianity was brought by Joseph of Arimathea, but that is legendary. Instead, there's relatively little evidence of Christians until about the time of Constantine. But in the 4th century, it seems pretty clear that most of the population of Roman Britain becomes Christians. In fact, enough so that a lot of the people in the countryside, the villages, on the farms, Christian chapels show up in very rural areas, and we even have a distinct type of Christianity forming in Roman Britain called Pelagianism. They believe that you are saved and go to heaven based on the good you do rather than the quality of your faith. This idea will be shot down by St. Augustine, the great North African, though it definitely remains something real for a lot of Christians. Now, as we enter the 5th century and see that Roman Britain doesn't have a lot of the problems found on the continent by other provinces. They don't really have a major barbarian threat. There are raids by pirates from the Picts, the Scots, or the Irish, and the Saxons in northern Germany. But these are fairly small potatoes. These are, raids in small boats by small groups of raiders. The Romans have built fortifications along the coast to watch out for piracy and defend the island. But Roman Britain, as everything begins to go sideways at the beginning of the 5th century, seems to be in pretty good shape. Its army is largely intact, and its army does have the bad habit of creating its own emperors. The most famous, of course, being Constantine the Great, who began his career in the city of York. There are others, Magnus Maximus, who conquered about half the Roman Empire using the British army. And finally, Constantine III. In 407, Constantine III and his soldiers see the Roman Empire in crisis. They see the Goths already moving into Italy and threatening Rome. They see the Emperor Honorius removing the army defending the frontier in northern Gaul to Italy, and see that this is a real danger. His troops declare him emperor, and under Constantine III's leadership, they cross over to Gaul, taking almost the entire military force with the goal of saving the empire from the barbarian invasions and putting Constantine III in power instead of Honorius. They leave in 410, and they won't come back. This is one of the coins of Constantine III. With the army gone and apparently beginning to have problems on their way to Italy, some of the British leaders, and we don't really know who, put together a letter to Emperor Honorius saying, hey, the army is gone. They have taken most of the governing officials. They've even taken the equipment for making coins. Could you please send us some help? Honorius writes back saying, I understand your troubles. They're very important to me, and I will get to them as soon as I can. But for the time being, stay put, keep doing things the right way, and we will get to you as soon as we have dealt with the Goths, the Vandals, all of these other groups. Of course, they'll have to wait a long time. Interestingly, after 410, with the Roman army gone, no new coins will be made in Britain for over 200 years. Coins remain in use, but they start wearing out. They start being lost. They start being buried in treasure. Gold and silver coins start being reused and turned into jewelry or other things you might want to make out of gold or silver. All of this suggests that money is disappearing. And it is not simply that there are no new coins. Part of the reason money is disappearing is that with the army gone, taxation decreases. Taxation decreased, there's less need for coins. People don't need to work quite so hard if they don't have to pay taxes. Government seems to be run by the landlords, the richest people in local areas. The economy begins to shrink, trade declines, people move to going by barter rather than using money. The economy continues to slide with less and less production being done, old materials being recycled. So, for instance, the digging of mines to find new sources of metal largely stops. Instead, it's much easier to go into buildings that have been abandoned and pull the metal out of them and reuse them. So most Roman era buildings in Britain have things like the lead water pipes removed and reused. All of this is signs of an economy in sharp decline. Who's running it, we cannot really say. It seems pretty obvious that it's probably on the local scale. Probably the wealthiest men in the different districts will set themselves up as more or less the government. Some of them will have created local militias now that the army's gone to defend against raids by pirates from the north or from Ireland across the sea. There seems to be some pretty good evidence that Christian tribes are recruited from the sort of the border areas to be brought as military protectors into the more peaceful areas. There's pretty good evidence that the old hill forts from before the Roman Empire are reoccupied and turned into fortresses at this point. Now, talking about the Irish for a moment. The Irish had a relationship with Britain going back into prehistory. They'd had connections with the Roman Empire, but Roman rule had never really extended to Ireland. As the empire declines and the military is withdrawn from Britain, piracy increases from Ireland against the western coast of Britain. Sometime more or less around 430, very important pirate raid happened. This particular pirate raid leads to the capture of a teenage boy named Patricius. Patricius is taken back to Ireland, where he is enslaved. As a slave, he is given responsibilities to watch a herd of animals. As a shepherd, he sees an opportunity after about 10 years of slavery, escapes, finds a ship that will take him to Britain, and goes back home. At home, having escaped slavery, he has a dream that gives him a vision. The people of Ireland calling for him to come back to teach them. Well, he gets a hold of a Bible, some other materials, gets himself anointed as a priest, and returns to Ireland as Patrick and begins preaching Christianity to the people who had enslaved him. Eventually, this will be the seed of the Catholic Church in Ireland. We have two written texts by Patrick, one where he discusses his life and his conversion, and the second, a long letter he writes after he has established a Christian community in Ireland. He writes it to another person in Great Britain named Caroticus. Caroticus is one of these warlords, and Caroticus and his men are Christians, or at least they claim to be, and they have kidnapped and enslaved some of the Christians who Patrick has baptized. And Patrick writes to condemn them, saying that you are Christians in name only. You have gone against the word of Christ by enslaving other Christians, and you should free them. This, interestingly, is the very first time a Christian says there's something wrong with slavery, and makes the point that Christians should not enslave Christians. He doesn't have a problem with slavery per se. He has a problem with Christians making other Christians into slaves, because he argues that all Christians are citizens of Christ, which is going from a Roman argument. It's a new one. It will grow over the next 1400 years. Now, while this is happening in Ireland, other things are happening back in Britain. What exactly happens is one of the more debated things in history. The sources are really terrible and contradictory, and the evidence of what happened is so vast that they don't really seem to explain it clearly. What does seem to have happened is around 449, once again, a group of British leaders, we do not know who they are, send a letter to the Roman government back in Italy asking for help. This goes to a man named Aetius. And Aetius writes back, and this is 449. You guys figure it out. Continue to wait. We will get to you. Of course, the letter comes at a point where Attila is at the height of his career. He's threatening Rome. He's threatening Gaul. He's threatening Constantinople. The Vandals are at the height of their power. It's just a few years before they sack and destroy much of the city of Rome. Britain is not very important to the Roman Empire. It is a priority, but it's priority number 20 or so. And the Britons are left to figure out what to do. This is so. What one of them is supposed to have done is really significant. Man who is, some sources, given the name Vortigern as which means superb tyrant or proud tyrant in Welsh, so it's probably not his real name. Seems to have been in charge, at least in southeast Britain. And he introduced to two brothers who are youths from what's now Denmark. Their names are Hengist and Horsa. And they have with them 3 shiploads of warriors. Vortigern hires them. Of course, there's no money with which to pay them. So he gives them land, a little island called Thanet, the extreme southeastern corner of Britain, in the county of Kent. And in return, Hengist and Horsa will wage war on his behalf against the Irish and the Picts, and so on. Now, this may not seem terribly significant, but if you look at this picture, there's Hengist and Horsa with the date in Roman numerals, 1776, because this was Thomas Jefferson's proposal for what should be on the Great Seal of the United States. Why Hengist and Horsa? Well, we'll see. Now, more Hengist and Horsa with their base send word back across the North Sea. More warriors come and join them. Their forces get larger. So, who are these guys? Well, first, they're coming in small boats like this one, with probably no more than about 50 people on board. You may notice there is no sail on this ship because the Germanic peoples living around the North Sea do not know how to make or use sails. They are basically giant rowboats. Because they're rowboats, every person on board needs to be able to pull an oar. So there's not a lot of room for children, elderly, probably not very many women. So basically all men, fairly young, say about 14 to 30. And these boats, you need everyone, all hands on deck to go back and forth. So it seems like it's usually a one-way voyage. It does not seem like a lot of people cross the sea in these boats. Probably no more than 10,000, possibly significantly less than 10,000. Remember, Hengist and Horsa just have 3 ships at the beginning. Now, the people on these boats are coming from a particular area of the Germanic world, the extreme northwest. This is the least affected by the Romans, the most backwards, the poorest, the least significant least Christian, least civilized area. Later tradition will describe the lands they come from, say that they are people of the Utes, they're in blue. South of them, the Angles, from the land of Angel, the Saxons from the northern part of Germany along the coast, and the Frisians living in the north of the Netherlands. The Frisians, interestingly, speak a language that even today is very, very close to English. But there aren't a lot of these people, and they seem to be a fairly mixed group of people from all of these tribes, as well as possibly some Franks. And they will mix together and form a new unit once they cross the sea. Now, this transition takes a while. At some point after they've worked for Vortigern for a number of years, Hengist leads a revolt against him. He now has a larger military force, maybe as many as 1,000 people, and he takes control over Kent, large county in southeastern England, and a lot of the southeast of the island. The struggle goes back and forth. Later stories describe how Vortigern tries to work out a peace deal. Vortigern and Hengist meet. Each of them bring 50 of their followers to a feast to work out a peace and a new way to get along. They make their speeches. Vortigern proposes a toast. Hengist proposes a toast. Hengist says the first sentence in English recorded, Sextus nimet dynatio, pull out your knives. And his followers stab the other guests to death. And it's a pretty violent struggle. The struggle goes back and forth. And it is not fast. We get from the oldest written description, a guy named Gildas writing maybe about 60 years later. So a number of the wretched survivors who were caught in the mountains and butchered wholesale, others broken by hunger, surrendered to the enemy. They were fated to be slaves forever. They were not killed straight away. And knew slowly Hengist and his followers are conquering the island. But the British don't just surrender. Instead, they find a savior, a man named Ambrosius Aurelianus, who was born into the purple, meaning that he was from an imperial family. And the last of the Romans, according to Gildas, rallies the Britons. They push the invaders back. He wins a lot of battles, especially a major one at a place called Mount Badon that leads to peace between the two sides. Well, this is where it gets kind of interesting. Later legend says the general at that battle of Mount Badon was a man named Arthur. We first get Arthur's name about 300 years later, written by a guy named Nennius, who calls him Dux Bellorum, battle leader of battles. It takes about another 200 years for Arthur to start being called Rex, or king. And really the full story of King Arthur only appears around 1138, when a man named Geoffrey of Monmouth writes a history of the kings of Britain, talking about how the British arrived in the island after the fall of Troy and taking it right down to the 7th century. Geoffrey's book is the 12th century equivalent of a bestseller. All across Western Europe, people want to know more about this Arthur and the stories about him. And many, 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 many stories are now written about him and his knights, Lancelot and Bors and Gawain and Percival, and so on and so forth. But these are stories from a later time. The stories of the Holy Grail and the Round Table and all of that are from the 12th century or later. There is absolutely no evidence of a real Arthur. All the stories are much, much later. Now, in reality, after Baden, one way or another, the Anglo-Saxons wage a second push, and they drive the British to the west. At this point, they probably are coming from 3 or 4 different starting places. We don't know exactly how the second wave happens, but we do know by about 590. So when the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes have been in the island for about 150 years, it looks something like this. The eastern half of the island, or the southeastern third of the island, shows the English kingdoms in red. These dominate the lowlands. They control most of the most fertile areas. They are not Christian. They practice Germanic paganism, worshiping the old gods, Woden, and Thunor, and so on, and Frey, ones in our days of the week. They cannot read or write. There are no written records in the areas they control. These kingdoms, and there are quite a few of them, are isolated from the rest of the world. They do not have strong ties of trade or communication with people outside of Britain. The western half of the island have the Celtic kingdoms in green. They are in the mountains and the less fertile western regions. They, however, are Christian. They can read and write. They do have connections by sea to Spain, to Africa, even to Egypt. There's a nice little text from Egypt about a voyage to Britain from just after the year 600. They, though, have lost the ability to speak Latin. They still use Latin in church. They are speaking their own British language, which is in the process of becoming Welsh, which is an Anglo-Saxon word meaning foreigner. They call themselves Cymry, the fellow citizens. Throughout the island, cities are gone, towns are gone. The island has changed a lot. And it is now an island where, instead of Rome and Britain, it is now in the south, the English and the Welsh. What exactly happened is very, very debatable. And in the next bit, I will give one theory that is not absolutely proven.